Okay, good morning, everybody. Okay, first, before we jump into, or I jump into what I want to cover today, I want to talk a little bit about the semantics of the discussion. The slide that was first on there talked about peacekeeping. And you talk a lot about peace support. And the term Paul used repeatedly here was peace operations. And I think really that's the more accurate term, because if you can't really look at these missions that they do, particularly in the African continent, and call them peacekeeping anymore. It just doesn't apply. I mean, if you think maybe with the Eritrea-Ethiopia border a while back, maybe that mission was peacekeeping. You had two conventional forces separated. There was a border in dispute. But everything else is not that. And then, so peace support kind of came in after that and said, well, it's peace support. But then you start peeling the layers back on the onion a little bit as well, and it's not really peace support. You're not supporting peace. I mean, it's this whole range. So sometimes it's hard to tell what they're doing, whether it's peace support operations, counterterrorism operations, or whatever it is. There's this broad range. So I think peace operations is really an accurate term, and within it, there's a lot of tactics and operations that fall under that whole term of peace operations. So I want to kind of try to avoid pigeonholing it as peacekeeping. It's a term that doesn't really apply anymore. Okay, Paul threw out some great data points and some others to support this. If you think about it, there's over 100 countries in the world that provide uniformed personnel to these missions. Uniformed personnel, mostly military, but also some police, when we're talking about. So the militaries as a whole are more likely to do these peace operations as a military than they are conventional operations. I mean, if you look at what militaries are traditionally designed to do, it's to fight and win their nation's wars, it's to protect the border, and still militaries are organizing these conventional structures. With the larger militaries have divisions, you have brigades, battalions, and even now, they're creating the Somali National Army and they're organizing brigades and battalions, and they have this conventional mindset. But in reality, what most militaries are doing are not conventional operations. They're doing peace operations. So as a result of that, more and more realize they have to direct their efforts and their resources to get better at it, because it's not the same. It's not the same skill set that you do. There's a lot of carryover when you get down to the soldier level task and the collective task, but it's just not the same. So over half of all the UN uniformed personnel in these missions are African. They come from African nations. You can see in the slide, over 39 countries on the African continent contribute to this. So there's lots of participation on the African side. And there's lots of assistance from what I'll call the Western side, mostly the US, the UK, and France, as Paul mentioned, but a range of other countries. I was just in a discussion with a team from the Netherlands just last week, talking about how they're going to do assistance in Burundi. And I know there's other Scandinavian countries do it, and just about every country, the Canadians, lots and lots of Western assistance going into this. Okay, so why does everyone do it? And Paul got at a lot of the reasons why. And it goes down to interests, both obviously the national interest on both sides, but also the regional interest. There's true, national security and regional security interest here at stake, particularly in the African context. But the other one is financial as well. I mean, if countries do this right and participate in these operations, they can make money from it. And that's important in a lot of these African countries where they have a continually under-resourced defense budget. So if they can throw into the mix that they get involved in a rotation scheme on a UN peacekeeping mission, like say Ghana, which constantly has 3 battalions out there rotating around to different missions. South Africa as well has 2 battalions constantly rotating. If it's done right, I say if it's done right, they can bring in money to the coffers. Now, it doesn't necessarily go directly to defense. It goes into the national treasury, and then it's up to a national security strategy to figure out how that money gets back to defense. But there's financial reasons for it. And then from the AU side of the house, it's an issue of legitimacy and credibility on their part. They see Africa as their responsibility. And in a lot of respects, they want to try to do this alone. In reality, they can't. I mean, if you think about what happened in Mali, the French ended up going into Mali, and I can make the point, because the AU couldn't, but really the point I want to make is the French couldn't do it. French couldn't do it alone. They relied on the U.S. to move them into Mali. So the AU shouldn't try to do this alone, because they can't do it alone, and they shouldn't have to do it alone. And so it really does need to be a partnership. It doesn't need to be a donor-donee relationship. So the AU, and it's a credibility thing on the AU's part. They want to be seen as being able to respond to these crises, which is in their sphere of influence that they have. Okay, so why did the nations do it? The Western nations do it. In the simplest of terms, it's comparative advantage. I mean, obviously there's this CNN factor, there's all this other stuff. But what it comes down to is the thinking is, okay, if we can provide this assistance to these nations to do it, we don't have to do it. We don't have to commit our resources to do these missions at a grand scale. We can do it for a lot less money. Now, granted, like I said, it's comparative advantage. We say, okay, maybe we can do it better if we just do it ourselves, but it costs a lot more. So that's kind of the thinking along a lot of the Western nations for why they want to do it. There's a lot of people who say, well, it's this whole boots on the ground thing, after Somalia, Black Hawk Down. My personal opinion, that's BS. I think that, Black Hawk Down syndrome and the boots on the ground syndrome, that died in 2003 when we started taking casualties in Iraq, and then all throughout from 2003 onwards. So I think we're over that. There's not this, throwback of, what happened in 1993 and in Somalia prevents us from putting troops in there. That's not a factor anymore in the political calculus and the decision making of why we don't put boots on the ground for these peacekeeping operations, in my opinion. Okay, so what's it look like when we do these missions? Normally it comes under the term what they call train and equip. Okay, everybody's heard it. So we get a mission coming up, and I'll throw one out there, say the Force Intervention Brigade in the Eastern DRC a while back. There was this idea that they were going to create a separate force within the MONUSCO, when did it change? MONUSCO, to go ahead and tackle this rogue group that was operating in the Eastern DRC. So they pulled some countries together from the SADC region. And so we came in and said, okay, Mali wants to play in this, great. We're going to throw in a training team in there. We're going to do some training for these guys, get a battalion ready. We're going to give them some equipment and send them up. And that happens all the time. It's the train and equip model. There's a need, there's a crisis. We come in, we do the training, we provide them some stuff, and we send them on our way to do their mission. Okay, that's what it looks like. However, if we're thinking about, do we want to create sustainable capacity and capability over time, does train and equip get at that? Okay, what's train and equip normally look like? Okay, when the Africans come together to get their training, 9 out of 10 times, it's a composite unit. They pull together what the requisite numbers are. They say, start with how many do we need? Okay, say we need 850. Okay, now we got to get 850. So, 50 over here, 25 there, maybe 200 if you're lucky from one unit. But it's not like you're going out there and training, 1st Battalion, 8th Infantry, 3rd Brigade Combat Team. You pull those guys in, and maybe you plus them a little bit to get them up from maybe an 85% readiness level to a 95 so they can deploy. I mean, this is where you're forming a composite unit just to do this mission. So you bring them all together. Okay, then you have a training team comes in, which in train and equip most likely is contractors. It's guys who have served some time in the U.S. military. They get out, they go back over these contracts for Dying Corps and some others, and they provide the training. And what's the equipment look like? A lot of times it's just off-the-shelf stuff. I mean, it's like walkie-talkies, and it's, the GPS units are Garmin's and all this. It's not military equipment that's entered into their military system that creates commonality, not only throughout their own force, but with other units on the continent where they have a life cycle system on what the equipment is. It's just standard kit to get them on their way and get them gone. Yeah, okay. So, is train and equip effective? And to answer that question, you got to really decide, okay, what are you trying to do with train and equip? Okay, what you're trying to do with train and equip is just react to a crisis, get a force ready, and throw them in there and get the job done. Yeah, I think they're creating some effects, and they're doing it. And could they improve? Absolutely. And if you talk to the ACOTA guys, which is the main program the U.S. uses to do this, I mean, they've laid it all out. They look at, okay, what they need to do better. But by and large, they do a good job. The trainers that go in there are more than capable. They train the task. They get these guys ready, and they send them in. But if you're trying to create sustainable long-term capability and capacity for these African countries so they can do it on their own over time, and then I would argue it's probably not as effective. Now go back to what I was saying about pulling this cohort unit together. Okay, so you bring all these guys together and you train them. And say if you're lucky and within a couple weeks of training, they deploy into the area of operations, which is not always the case, but let's say best case, they do. So they retain some skills while they're in there, depending on what they're doing. Again, they may not. A lot of units don't train when they're in the box, and all you guys know who deployed, that if you don't train, you lose it. So these guys go in there, they come out, and then they scatter, and they go away again. And so now what you have is individuals with experience, but you have no collective institutional capability from that group. So you're not really building that capacity. The other thing is these military skills, even if they come back, they have a little individual, maybe some team experience. But do they really have the skill sets that we're training anymore? And I would argue no. I mean, studies have shown that training lasts about 6 months. And then you pretty much have to start over again. I mean, I don't have the statistics in front of me, but there's a large degradation when they retest units that have received training, both individual soldier skills and collective task, over a period of time. After about 3 months, it starts degrading. Until about 6 months, they decide, okay, we need to retrain these guys from ground zero and get them back up to speed. And there's a lot of reasons for that, particularly in the collective. And really, it's because in militaries, there's this natural rotation cycle of promotion, transition, everything else. Units don't stay together, even in Western militaries, and even less so in these African militaries. So you're not really with this training. So a CODA would they would say, we've trained 250,000 African peacekeepers. Okay, so does that mean there's 250,000 trained African peacekeepers out there? No. Okay, they've trained guys. If they're lucky, they maintain their skills for about 6 months. And then it goes away unless there's an institution that persists to keep that training going. Okay, so how do you get at that and do that? And, it's more complex than train the trainer. A lot of people will say, okay, what you have to do is you have to train the trainer and then let the Africans do the training over time. Absolutely, that's certainly something you have to do. And a CODA, and before that, the ACRI program back in the late 90s, early 2000s has tried that. And so it's not for wanting to do that, but what happens is they train these trainers, 6 months later they come back and they're not there anymore. They're not being used by the military where they receive the training to be this institutionalized cadre that sticks around, and then they don't replenish themselves. Like, so say if you're an instructor at the infantry school at Fort Benning, you're a small group instructor, you go there for a couple of years tour, but when you leave, there's another guy coming in behind you, he gets the training, he does the instruction, he gets certified as instructor, he rotates in behind you, and that training cadre persists. And that's missing within the institutions within these African militaries. So it's not quite as simple as train the trainer. Okay, what about the training centers? People say, oh, well, there's the Kofi Annan Training Center in Ghana, there's the KIPTC in Kenya, and there's others out there. Yeah, they do good things, but for the most part, they're training individuals on classroom-type instruction, on specific blocks of instruction. They're not training units to go out there and go into these conflict zones, and they're not creating that institutional recurring capacity within a nation's military. So they're great tools to supplement that, but they don't take the place of that. So I would argue that change really has to begin with a mutual desire for change on both parties. The U.S., I'll talk about the U.S. now, they need to be disciplined and make a decision and say, okay, if this country doesn't have the institutions in place or the political will to create the institutions that will help them to do, which means you're going to identify a cadre, you're going to keep it in place over time, and you're going to introduce this training curriculum into your whole training cycle, into your professional military education system, then we're not going to do the training with you. Now, there'll be times, obviously, they'll have to do it when a real crisis arises. I understand that. But really, these training equip models we talked about earlier should be the exception and not the rule to how we do business. So that's the political will on one side. On the other side, it's on the African military side of the house. They need to make some changes, and they need to decide, okay, this is really what we want. We want to create this capability in ourselves to sustain this skill set if we're going to keep doing it. If we want to get this financial supplement of participating, if we want to look after our national and our regional, sub-regional security interests, we need to have this capability in-house. So we're going to make a commitment that we're going to build these institutions. We may start small with mobile training teams, but we're going to fence off these instructor cadres. When we get train the trainer, which occurs, we're going to keep these guys in place or gals in place. We're going to replenish them. We're going to build the ability to train ourselves at the cadre level first. And then we need to target the assistance to where we need it to fill the deltas. Because, like I said earlier, we can't do it alone. So I'm not saying that there's not a role for the Western partners to play or for the private military contractors to play. But it has to be targeted as to what deltas are within these institutional systems that they're trying to build to get at that. Okay. Paul had mentioned in his presentation, he said, well, what do we want to invest in? And I would argue to this point, we spent a lot of money without really a return on investment. So I would argue that it's not really, we haven't been investing in anything. We've been spending. Okay, so an investment applies that you're going to get something back in the end. And if you look at the GAO report I threw up earlier, the CODA program or GPOI was only spending about 12% of their money. And that was just their own internal review on institution building within the program. All the rest was spent on these training equipment missions, which, you know, everyone can justify. It's not saying that it didn't need to be done. But if your goal is to create sustainable capability and capacity over time, you're not investing, you're just spending. And if you look at these two quotes on there, I think it gets at it, at what the policy should be. So then the question is, okay, so why aren't we really knuckling down and adhering to that policy in the way we do business? Okay, let me wrap up and say one thing. I talked about the standard train and equip model and how we pull together, the Africans pull together these battalions, and we train them all these skills. And you go in and you look at the UN has two really good field manuals on training peacekeeping battalions. And you open it up, and it's those familiar with the U.S. system, it looks very familiar. Task condition standards, tells you how to train it, task by task. You know, it's, searching a vehicle, coordinate search, convoy operations, manning an OP, all the stuff that you would think would be in there. So it's good stuff. And I would argue that probably anybody can train that. And these African militaries can train that. That's not really where the focus needs to be. Think about peacekeeping missions that don't do well. Rarely is it that they don't do well because they can't do those type tasks. They don't do well, discipline's one of them, but they don't do well because they don't get logistics right, is the big thing. They don't do well because they don't get intelligence, ISR right. They have no capability to do intel fusion and react on it. They don't get the medical stuff right. Very few of them can sustain themselves medically. They don't have field hospitals, even basics like combat first aid and the kits with everyone else. They don't do engineering right, okay? And there's a real need for that in these peace operations on the continent. So those are the kind of things that really should be what these countries are looking for from outside assistance, and what outside actors should be looking for to partner with these countries as well. Okay, what is it they don't do well? And I would argue that probably the number one priority needs to be logistics. And yet we continue to spend more and more money over and over again on training, you know, infantry or basic soldier type tasks. And I think that needs to change to make improvement over time. Okay, I think I'm going to wrap up because I used most of my time. But I'll get at some of this in the questions. If there's anything I said that raises a point, or if you disagree or you got experience out there, please ask in the question. I'd be more than happy to get into it in more detail. Thanks.